And I think that's the other challenge with CSS is when you're in other languages, you're really just focused on like functionality. Whereas with CSS, you're controlling the like a visual layout on the page, and there's so many unknowns and so many different things. A lot of it was opening the dev tools and looking at like what's actually happening here when I do display flex. Display flex and like, oh, these columns are different sizes. Well, why is that happening? And then you sort of, I thought display flex made columns, but why are the columns different sizes? And then I'm diving into that and then doing, trying to figure out what's actually happening and why those things are happening. Don't tell yourself that like, oh, I have to master this before I go on to the next thing, because you're never ever going to master it. You're going to get better and better and more comfortable with it. Hi, I'm Kevin, and this is the Developers Cafe podcast. Yeah, so as I said, my name's Kevin, and I am someone who focuses on the world of CSS almost completely, primarily. That's sort of my thing. I know it's something that people get frustrated with that are coming from other areas of other languages, or people that are just beginners. Once you get past the simple syntax of it, it often becomes a little bit more frustrating. And so my goal is to help people fall in love with it a little bit, or at least get past their frustrations and see that it's not so bad after all.
Cool. So how was your journey into tech like? Were you always a CS enthusiast, or later in your career, you felt in love with it?
Yeah, so I had a really strange path, I guess, to get to where I am now, where I've started making websites in the very end of the 90s, just as a hobby when I was in school. And it was just mucking around more than anything else. And then it was something that I would come back to like randomly, like 2 years later. Oh, I need to do this. And oh, look, there's more stuff now to learn. And it was always something that I was interested in, but just on the side. And then eventually, I actually was into design, and I was working at a small design agency that I enjoyed, but it wasn't the most well-paying job. So I was doing freelance work on the side. And because I'd been making websites and playing with websites, a lot of the design work I was getting was for web stuff. And I said, well, maybe I could charge my clients more by making the design and by coding it. And I eventually realized I enjoyed that side of things more than the design side. And a lot of what I did was CSS, because I was doing a lot of WordPress work at the time, and it would be child themes. And basically, I'd do a lot of I'd strip. The child theme would be I'd keep a lot of the functionality, but delete the CSS file and just make my own from scratch, basically. So it was a lot of just writing CSS. So ever since then, it's what I've sort of been focused on for the most part, and just sort of using the other stuff as I need to. But yeah, it's always, since I've been doing it, it's sort of always been the part that I think has drawn me to it the most.
So since the beginning of your career, you fell in love with CSS, nothing else?
Basically, yeah.
So were you always a teacher?
Not always, but I have been for a long time. When as I said, I was working in the design agency and then freelancing on the side. And then it was while I was doing that, I got my old school actually contacted me, and they needed some extra teachers or new teachers, and asked if I wanted to apply. And because the pay wasn't so good at my job that I was currently at, I said, why not? And it was never anything that I'd planned on getting into or thought I would get into, but it ended up being, I ended up really enjoying it and liking it. So that would have been, I don't remember the timelines very well, but I think that was about 8 years ago. So first I was working just in the classroom, and I did that for about 3 years before I started anything online. But yeah, so it has been a bit of a strange journey for me to get to the point where I'm teaching CSS, considering I never even saw that, web development wasn't even what was in my sight line when it came to a career. And then so to be known as a teacher for that, it's definitely not where I planned to go, but yeah.
So what was the age group of the audience you were teaching? Were the school children, college folks?
Yeah, it was a vocational school, so it was adults. It was anywhere 18 plus, basically. I'd say most people were sort of in their 20s. That it was either people that they finished high school or they even went to college or something, but then wanted to do something new, or people that had a career that wanted to change their career and stuff like that. So it was a bit of a mix of different age groups, but all adults. Yeah.
So what approach you took while teaching them CSS as you were the first time teacher. So what experience was that like?
Um, the first time made me realize I didn't know what I was doing. um, it was one of those things where I understood. It made me realize like I could make something happen. Like, okay, I know how to make this layout, but it was just following the same. Okay, I did it this time because I did it last time and it worked, and I didn't really understand why it worked. I just knew that it did. And then the first time you're sort of going, okay, this is the steps you need to do, and they're like, why? And you're like, oh, because I don't know. So yeah, the very beginning was very humbling, and definitely I attribute a lot of being good at CSS and web development and all of that because I've had to teach it. And I really think that by teaching it, it's made me much, much better at it. And it's forced me to have a better understanding of it so I can actually properly explain what we're doing, why we're doing it, how it's working, and all of that.
So was it after your teaching career that you decided that you will start creating content on CSS as well?
I was still teaching. The reason I started my channel was because the class I was doing like an introduction to HTML and CSS. Basically, there was two, like an introduction and then sort of the next class after that I was doing over and over and over again. And as a new teacher, it was really nice being able to teach over and over again because you actually got good at that material and I could learn it well and sort of adapt what I was teaching. And I was really happy I had that opportunity. But after 3 years of doing that, I was getting a little bit bored of the basics. And so part of the reason I started the channel was to be able to keep up myself and, let's do things that aren't the very basics. And at the time, CSS right now is going through a lot of new stuff, but even back then it was a little bit slower, but there was new things that were sort of slowly trickling in and I didn't want to miss out on it. There was a channel that I had followed for a long time, which was Dev Tips with Travis, which I loved, and he stopped. And that was one of the things that sort of kept me in the loop a little bit of what was going on. And then so without that channel being there, it left a bit of a void as well. So to fill the void, and I couldn't find another channel that was covering that type of material, so I decided to make my own.
It's interesting that you mentioned about another channel. So do you learn by videos or do you learn better by blogs or docs rather?
Yeah, I learn mostly through either tutorials or docs for the most part. I find it easier. So it is kind of funny that I teach through video, even if that's not my main go-to for learning. But I do think for me anyway, what works the best is sort of going through the docs or going through a blog or something, just because you can see it there. It's not moving. You don't have to pause or anything like that. And sort of trying to understand and use that. But then video for me is nice if I'm sort of, the docs or things like that. Sometimes you'll understand a little bit, but you're not sure how to apply it. And so that's where if I am stuck, I'll go, okay, I'm going to watch a video on this, because then you're seeing how someone's using it or something like that. That sometimes can just make that extra connection that you're missing. So a little bit of both, but definitely I start always with written content.
Now, I'm going to assume that you are working with CSS for almost 20 years ish. So CSS is something, it seems very simple. It looks very simple. The syntax and everything is very simple. So how do you challenge yourself, or is that challenge not there now? Like it's easy for you now.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the simple syntax tricks us a little bit into thinking it's a very simple language. There's a lot going on with it and the more I dive into it, the more I realize like, oh, that's why that works that way. And that's, you sort of get into the things that are less talked about when it comes to the layout and layout algorithm and everything and how that works, and all of that. So definitely on that front, like I feel like I'm still always learning and better understanding what's actually going on. And even like things like Flexbox, display flex, I get columns, but then understanding how that's actually happening took me quite a while. So, it was still digging in and really understanding it, playing around with it a lot. So I'm not bored with it yet, that's for sure. And with all the new things that are coming now, it's sort of the timing of my channel maybe couldn't have been better, just because with all the new stuff that's landing now and that's on the horizon, I don't think I'm going to be short on content anytime soon.
That's the best thing for a content creator, having loads of content. So CSS is a very niche topic.
Hmm.
Has it been very difficult for you creating content on CSS for almost like the 5-6 years now?
Um, I never thought that I would the channel would become anything. I started it more as a hobby project and to keep me going than anything else. So I've been surprised with how well it's done because, as you said, it's a bit of a niche topic. But it's definitely, I think, I guess I got my little sort of corner there that I can have fun with, and it's enough going on with it, and it's enough of a something that people do need. And in a way, it's funny because it's like a niche topic in a sense, but at the same time, you can't really have a page or an app without it. So you know it's something that everybody uses in one way or another, whether it's writing vanilla CSS or it's using a framework or a library or something else. Basically everybody's using it in one sense or another. So even if it's not somebody's primary focus, they still need it, and so it works out for me in that sense too.
You mentioned frameworks in this answer. So do you think that beginner folks who are learning CSS for the very first time, should they focus on the basic CSS for like a good amount of time, or you can simply switch to frameworks in the initial stages itself?
It's a good question. I think that, I mean, part of it does come down to like why would you want to use the framework? So like if I'm in the middle of learning JavaScript and that's really my focus of what I'm learning right now, and I just need a layout that's going to work and it's really simple, and I'm not focused on that. I just need that there so I have it there. Then I think it's fine, and you get something quickly. It's on the page, it's working, and you're not stressed about it because you're focused on one thing. And I think that's a better way to learn than trying to learn 10 different things at once. I do think that if you're trying to use it or learn it a little bit better, that it acts as a bit of a crutch. And sometimes you don't, even going back to like, I know Bootstrap's still popular and there's other ones like Tailwind and other stuff that are becoming more popular. But, you're better at using those tools if you know CSS itself. So I do think that while it might not be your focus or something you want to dive into, that understanding the core language, at least you don't have to go in as deep as I've gone into it, but having a decent understanding of it, even if you want to use those tools to work faster, makes your life a lot easier, because customizing things like Bootstrap can be really hard. And so using or a better understanding of it really helps. And I actually learned a lot about CSS by using Bootstrap uh, way back in the day, but it wasn't because I was using Bootstrap. It's because I was looking at how they did things. So I didn't want to, sorry for the noise. I wasn't happy just using it. I was looking at like, okay, this is how they're doing their class naming. This is how they're organizing these things. Here's how they're doing all of that. And I stopped using Bootstrap, but I took a lot of things away from how they were working. So I think that's also worth, I think they're a good tool for speeding things up sometimes, but they're also something that you can, if you dive into how they work, you can learn a lot from them as well.
You mentioned that before diving into frameworks, you should know how CSS works. Now, this might be a naive question to ask, but CSS seems simple, seems easy. So, to challenge yourself becomes difficult. If I'm able to replicate a mockup, I feel that I know CSS. So, how do you think that folks can get better at CSS? How can they keep on improving?
Yeah, I mean, if you're able to make a layout and get everything working, then that's obviously you're on the right track. And maybe you have, depending on what you're after, maybe that's enough. I do know that just based on my experience and the questions that I get, that I think a lot of people sort of hit a wall at one point where they, oh, this is easy, I can do this, and then all of a sudden they start running into situations that they just have no idea, or they don't know why things are going wrong, or why they try something and it doesn't work and they don't know why. And I think that's where the more you build stuff, the more you start realizing the limitations in what you know. And that's where a lot of the frustration comes, because people go, well, this isn't working how I think it should work. See, it's obviously a problem with CSS and how CSS works because I can't do this, or the way it's doing it is stupid, or whatever it is. And there's a few little strange things, definitely, like collapsing margins is one of the worst things in the world. But once it's not always the problem that's with CSS, it's just the approach. So I mean, it could just be using positioning for stuff instead of using other layout tools. It could be setting fixed sizes or setting fixed heights for things when you should just be letting the layout sort of flow, and other things like that. And I think that's the other challenge with CSS is when you're in other languages, you're really just focused on like functionality. Whereas with CSS, you're controlling like a visual layout on the page, and there's so many unknowns and so many different things, from the size of the screen to the resolution to the contrast to the colors to like, we don't have a lot of that control. And it's sort of like the mental model that we need to approach to make layouts with these different elements that have relationships with one another instead of just being these isolated things, and all of that. So yeah, a really long way to say that I think that just the more you build, the better at it you'll get. And I think, challenging yourself to make more complex things is where you start realizing sort of the limitations on what you actually know. And when you do run into those problems, it's usually not CSS's fault. It's just our misunderstanding of it.
Right, right. I agree with that. That makes sense. You mentioned that CSS frustrating people. I have seen many of folks getting frustrated with Flexbox, Grid, and whatnot. So, have you faced that kind of an experience in your early career? And if yes, how did you deal with that?
Yeah. So, I mean, when I first was starting, it was, or if you go really far back to when I did it as a hobby, it was table-based layouts, which were a nightmare. And then it was after that, it was float-based layouts, which for anyone who hasn't had to deal with those, be very happy. It wasn't a fun way to work, and it wasn't a real layout tool, but it got the job done. And it was really, that was back when for me, I did it because it worked, and I didn't really fully understand it until I had to teach it. And that's, I think, where I realized that how important it is to know, okay, like if I'll use the float as an example, even though we shouldn't be using it today, but it would make sort of a layout happen, and I could use a clear fix and get around the issues with it. And okay, that worked. So I was very happy with that. But then when I had to teach it, I had to understand what was actually happening. And then once I understood that, I could actually get it to work in so much of a better way. So the same thing even with like Flexbox. When I started teaching Flexbox, and I was getting into like the specifics of like, a lot of it was opening the dev tools and looking at like what's actually happening here when I do display flex. Display flex and like, oh, these columns are different sizes. Well, why is that happening? And then you sort of, I thought display flex made columns, but why are the columns different sizes? And then I'm diving into that and then doing, trying to figure out what's actually happening and why those things are happening. And then you understand how that tool actually works. And then when you understand how the tool is working, you can use it so much more efficiently. I realize not everyone has time to like be going through tons and tons of documentation to figure those things out. So that is part of what I try and teach as well, to hopefully sort of condense things down like that. Because, if it takes me hours to do, and I'm lucky I can spend the time doing that, to then try and, okay, let's condense everything I learned down to 20 minutes so you can figure it out in a shorter period of time.
Do you feel that your teaching career has somehow helped you as a content creator?
Yes. So yeah, 100%. A lot of, I think the two ways it's helped me, or the primary way it helped me was by hearing questions coming from students. So like teaching in the classroom, where you realize that when you're explaining something, you have a lot of things that you understand that you just take for granted, that somebody who's learning that, they don't have. And so when you're trying to explain something and then there's 10 questions because you assumed they knew something that they didn't know. And so that really helped me realize that when I'm trying to explain things, I need to think of all, like, okay, this is what I'm trying to explain, but what prerequisite knowledge do they have to understand that one thing? So I think it's really helped me sort of break things down when I do want to teach something online, because when you're doing it online, you don't get that feedback. So by having taught in the classroom, it really helped me realize that. So I think that was the biggest way that it definitely helped me.
I have seen that you make courses as well. and you make content on YouTube as well. So are they in some kind different? Like, is your mode of teaching different? Like, what's the difference between those two things?
Yeah, that's a good question. On one of the differences I'd say is YouTube is more like, here's this one topic in 10 to 30 minutes a lot of the time.
Right.
So it's like, okay, let's look at this or let's look at that. And the way I see it is, if somebody's going on YouTube, often they want to solve a problem. So I just want to have a video that solves that one thing. So here's how you do X or here's how you do Y. Whereas a course for me is something that's a lot more, okay, we're starting from this point and we want to reach this point. So we have this path that we're going to follow to try and bring you along with me to get you from wherever you are now to this final result. So it's less about like single pieces of knowledge and how we can actually build build the knowledge on top of each other to reach like a final point. And the thing I like to do with courses too is also like, YouTube's very just, here's the video. With courses, it lets me be a little bit more multimodal. So here's the project that you can do. Here's some practice files that you can do. Here's a chat, like try doing this on your own. I'm not giving you the solution. Here's some written content that goes with it. Here's links to other resources that you can read more about. So I see it as a lot more of an in-depth way of teaching. It's still something I struggle with because after having taught in the classroom where you're really hands-on and you can answer the questions directly and there's hands going up as you're explaining things, not having that feedback is still hard for me. So I'm still trying to find ways as much as possible to introduce sort of more levels of sort of, as much of these different things I can put in place to sort of replicate that feeling, just because I do, having done online courses and having been in the classroom, I think there's more value, the more sort of multimodal and everything that you can get that you usually see in the classroom. So it's still something I'm trying to improve on as much as I can. But yeah, that's sort of the long answer to what should have been a short question.
Most of my audience is college going folks who are learning front end development for the first time. They come from HTML and they learn CSS. Now I've seen two kinds of people. One who think that CSS is easy, make one project and move on. Other people are those who feel that it's something to give more time on, and they keep on doing CSS for a long period of time. So what do you think is the midway? How can someone decide that, okay, now my CSS is done, I can move on to JavaScript, I can move on to other things?
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember is that first you will have to know all of them. And the having to know all of them, it's also like the relationship between them, because I think the relationship between HTML and CSS is very obvious. You link into your content and you style your content, especially when you first look at JavaScript. Sometimes people will start looking at it and go, oh, I'm going to keep going with HTML and CSS because JavaScript is so different and so foreign. And just when I first started learning JavaScript, as someone who's self-taught on it, I think other people might feel the same way, where it's a little bit like learning math in high school, where you sort of understand the concepts that you're seeing, but you don't see the point of it. Because there's a lot of sort of upfront theory before you get into the more actual, like, now we're using it to do stuff. And you're adding classes, you're manipulating CSS sometimes, you're doing different things, and there's this sort of three-way connection. I do think that it's important that you're comfortable with what you know, because I think if you just go, I'm going to learn everything at once, you just get overwhelmed and there's too much happening. So I do think like having a certain level of comfort with a language before moving on is important. But I do think that, I've been teaching CSS for at least 8 years now, and I'm still learning new things with it. So like that journey of learning new stuff is never going to end. So don't tell yourself that like, oh, I have to master this before I go on to the next thing, because you're never ever going to master it. You're going to get better and better and more comfortable with it, but you're always going to be getting better. So, don't tell yourself like, I need to be a master. Just say, okay, I'm getting comfortable with it. I feel like I'm doing all right. Now let's add some JavaScript into this and sort of focus on that. Keep my CSS knowledge where it is while I work on JavaScript. And as you're doing that, you're going to learn new things about HTML and you're going to learn new things about CSS, and your learning is just going to continue from there.